Shalom Aleichem, and welcome back to part 2 of Balabatish Questions, a 4-part Shtark Tank series on the mindset of being a Ben Torah in the workforce. If you haven't yet listened to part 1 about the question of identity, I would recommend giving it a listen first. Thank you so much to the Ian Institute for sponsoring this series. Are you looking for hard-hitting analysis of the Haredi draft controversy and other issues that Haredi society is grappling with? Make sure to check out the Ian Institute. You can subscribe to their newsletter and check out their fascinating new podcast at the links in the show notes. In this episode, Zevi Reinitz and I continue the conversation and ask ourselves the second Balabatish question. Why do Balabatim often have very negative self-talk? For example, I finished a Masechta, but I didn't really learn it well. I can't give that drasha, I'm not really smart enough. Is this humility or lack of self-confidence? Zevi points out that you find this dynamic in a very unlikely place. Stay tuned for more. My name is Yaakov Wolff, and this is Shtark Tank.
Okay, so Yaakov, in our first conversation, we talked about identity and about this tension that a lot of us feel at different points in our career, Torah career, between working and learning, how to look at that, how to view ourselves, and we talked a lot about the optimism of reframing positively and living a lichatchila life. But let's be real, right? At the end of the day, not everything is always so rosy. People do get down on themselves. People can be self-critical. And so I thought it'd be great to just pause on that point and to just talk about this whole notion of self-talk, self-criticism, because naturally whenever you're in a situation where you are, questioning your priorities, you're questioning your progress. Am I doing the right thing? Am I good enough? Am I, should I be working, learning? Should I be learning more? Do I have enough skills or whatever that self-talk looks like? I think that's a very real part of called the Balabus experience. And so I wanted to just zoom in on that a little bit more and talk and unpack why it is that we speak negatively about ourselves. Why is that something which seems to be pervasive in the Torah community and the Balabatish community? And is that something which, playing off of what we said in the first segment, is that something which we might be able to reframe in a way that's more helpful? So I'm just curious, I'm no longer in yeshiva full-time. You are more, let's say, in the day-to-day yeshiva context. I'm just curious to know, is that something which you see, or to what extent do you see that amongst students that are actively in yeshiva? Do you get a sense that there is kind of this pervasive trend of constantly being self-critical or speaking down to yourself? Is that something that you see manifesting itself day to day in kind of a normal yeshiva setting?
100%. I've had countless conversations with students, and I've spoken to mashkichim who are far more seasoned than this because I wanted to get some feedback at how I was handling these conversations, and they basically all told me this is the conversation. We have it with students all the time. They're always coming to us, coming to express their self-doubt, self-criticism, feeling unsuccessful, feeling unaccomplished, and they say this is the issue that comes up all the time.
So that's fascinating. It's not surprising, but it is fascinating. And I've been thinking about these issues a lot, not just in preparing for this conversation, but just in general over the last several years. So the accepted statistic, I guess, in the psychology world, let's say, of we think a million thoughts a day. We're thinking all the time. We're constantly chirping and talking to ourselves, each in our head. Take a guess, what percentage of your internal self-talk would you say is statistically is negative? What would you guess?
I'd say maybe 50-50.
So apparently it's 80%. 80% is the baseline that many people claim. That is 80% of the thoughts that are going through our head are negative. And the reason why that's incredible is not just because it's a very large number, but because the number of things that we say to ourselves, right? Another statistic that they talk about is the number of thoughts that a person can think, the number of words that a person can think in a minute is anywhere between 3,000 to 6,000. We can think so fast. We're processing so many things at any given situation. We're talking to ourselves. So imagine you're taking basically like a State of the Union address type thing every 2 minutes, and 80% of it is just yelling at yourself, telling yourself how you're not enough and you're not good. And then you put that in the context of learning, where a person is always kind of like trying to stack up and measure themselves potentially against other people. It can be a very, very heavy way of doing things. Now, what I've seen in yeshiva is that this kind of manifests itself in two ways, and maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong. But I kind of see this negative self-talk coming out and expressing itself in two different paths. Number one is, I guess we'll call it the humility, the cool kind of attempt at being humble. You could have the superstar student who is accomplished, but because the Torah world puts such an emphasis on being an unav, so it's like I just making a siyum hashas, but yeah, I'm not so great. I'm not so great. I'm not this. I'm not that. That's one thing where really the person is, it's like a humble brag kind of thing. I think the other way I see it expressing itself is like the real, tangible, authentic kind of self-doubt and self-criticism, where a person just doesn't think they're enough. And I see that from my side as like, amongst other Balabatim who are incredibly talented and smart and accomplished, you hear kind of things like, I can't give that Dvar Torah in shul. I can't give the shir on Shabbos. I can't give the chabura. I would never be able to do this, or I'm not. And you hear people talk about themselves in a way which is very limiting, and so I really think that that's why this is such an important conversation to have. I'm curious, do you see it manifesting itself in a particular way in the yeshiva context and in students that are coming up?
So I'm not a big time mashgiach. I don't spend hours and hours speaking to students, so my sample size is a little bit smaller, but I definitely see more of the second expression of that idea. Whereas a guy will come to me, he's a good guy. He's smart. He's doing what he's supposed to be doing. He behaves. He comes to davening. He comes to seder. He's working hard, and he's just like a good kid. He's not a superstar. He's not making siyum mashas as you said. And he'll just be like so self-critical and so unsure of like, how can I be better? How I'm really not doing enough. I'm really not being successful. And I just like try to like shake him and say like, you're doing great. You're a good kid. You're smart. You're behaving. You're disciplined. You're doing what you're supposed to be doing. And I just sometimes it's even like maddening. Just like these guys are just good boys, and like why can't they see that they're just good boys?
Yeah, and so on the one hand, we could look at this like really simply, and we could just say, you know what? It's like any other kind of, you would have this conversation in any other field, professionally or whatever, and you would say it's just, you have to be more self-confident and you have to build self-esteem, and maybe the negative self-talk is just a negative thing, and it shouldn't be there. What's interesting though, specifically in the context of learning and of like developing our relationship with Torah, is that we actually see examples of people who we respect, ostensibly, people who, the giants of the Torah world, who seemed to do this. And I'll give you, one clear example. One way that you can see this pretty clearly is if you look at the introductions to people's Sfarim, right? It's people publish Sfarim. They've been doing it for generations, hundreds, thousands of years. We have Rishonim publishing there. And each one they write, introductions about what the motivation behind the book was, and about themselves, and whatever other thank yous or acknowledgments they put in there. What's interesting is that you can find authors who publish books, and if you read through the introduction to these beautiful, beautiful contributions to the Torah world, they're incredibly self-deprecating. They talk about themselves, I'm nothing, I'm an FS, this is not so good, you're probably going to find mistakes. And it was always interesting to me to read that, because number one, I thought on a very human, practical level, I said, like almost like mima nafshach. If you thought it was not good enough, and you're not good enough, so why did you publish this in the first place? And if you're publishing this beautiful 10-volume set of Chidushim Anshas, then why are you saying that it's not so great? So I never really understood that, and I actually want to dive into that a little bit. But my point is simply to say that, interestingly, we see that this is something that the Torah world does, and so I'm curious to know, have you, like, what your initial read on that is? Why is it, if, let's say, if a student would come to their high school counselor or whatever in a totally different context, or a professional coach or whatever, a life coach, and talk about self-deprecating, self-talk, the emphasis would be completely on kind of trying to shut it down and trying to build self-esteem. Whereas, like, ironically, in the Jewish world, we see examples of people who are, on the one hand, super successful and accomplished, and at the same time overtly putting themselves down and talking about themselves as nothing. So I'm curious to know, like, what, if you have a quick read on that. How do you justify those two things?
So if we go back to our previous conversation about, like, does this serve us? What does this do for us? So I always go back to what people in certain yeshivas like to quote about the Netziv and about the Maratz Chayes. Like, no one thought they were going to be anything. Everyone thought that they were just going to be an absolute nothing. And look at what they became. So that can be very, very practical. You take someone who thinks he's going to be absolutely nothing, and you tell him, look, you could be the Gadol Hador. Like, look at what the Netziv did. Look what he did. Look what that guy did. So that could be very practical. But that could also, at the same time, be very, very dangerous, because anyone who thinks he should be on that track and then he doesn't feel like he's there, so every day that he's not yet feeling like he's really headed in that direction, so then he's just feeling like failure, because he's been set this ideal picture in his mind of, like, well, yeah, I started as nothing, but I could be the Gadol Hador. Well, I'm starting as nothing, and I'm on my way to being a mediocre balabas. So now in that frame, it just looks like a failure.
So that's definitely, I think there's definitely a lot to be said for that. And I actually want to suggest and illustrate what you're saying, just to expand a little more. I want to illustrate it with a comparison of two introductions, if we're focusing on the introductions to Sfarim. So we've already painted this picture of, like, the self-deprecation approach, and that is something, there's a lot of different examples and that you can find in Sfarim that you open up. One particular example that I found recently was the introduction to the Kehillas Yaakov of the Stipler. And I say this lovingly. I love, the Kehillas Yaakov was a foundational contribution to the Iyun world and learning at a high level, and many people listening to this may be familiar with it. The Stipler Gaon, who lived in Bnei Brak, the father of Rav Chaim Kanievsky, and he wrote his work on Shas, and he writes in his introduction a lot of the kinds of things that I said. He says, I'm publishing this, but every time I look at this, I find mistakes, and I'm not worthy. And it didn't necessarily strike me as notable at the time when I first engaged it, but the reason why I'm bringing it up now is because I actually want to contrast that approach with another approach that I found in the Torah world by none other than his son, Rav Chaim Kanievsky, Zichron Levrach, who passed away. Actually, we're coming up on Purim. Passed away Purim a couple of years ago. And if you look at the first sefer, I believe, that Rav Chaim Kanievsky published, which I think is called Nachal Eisan, on the halachos of Egla Rufa, so a very well done sefer on a very esoteric topic. Rav Chaim, if you read his introduction, if you compare the two, father and son, it's a very stark contrast. Because interestingly, if you open up the Nachal Eisan, Rav Chaim, you almost can hear him being proud of himself. Okay, so I want to read to you just two lines from this introduction of Rav Chaim's sefer. Now again, I just want to frame this, put it in context. So this is Rav Chaim Kanievsky's first sefer that he wrote. And he was not a loud, person who was always promoting himself. God forbid. He was a incredibly measured person.
He was never a Rosh Yeshiva. He never had a formal role in any sense.
Exactly right. So he was never. You can never accuse him, God forbid, of running after kavod or something like this. And Rav Chaim writes the following. He says, "Why did I write this sefer basically on Egla Rufa?" And he says, "V'hinei." He's talking about himself. Bialdusi, in my youth, samti libi be'ezrat Hashem livarer halacha zu. I wanted to focus on this halacha of Egla Rufa, shel Egla Rufa, ad kama sheyadai magas, as much as I possibly can, as much as my kochos will allow. Ki ein lanu al zeh harbe me rishonim v'achronim. No one else has written extensively about this in the Rishonim and the Achronim. V'kama she'elot usfekot sheyesh la'orer bazeh. And there's a lot of questions that one's studying this topic can ask that have simply not been dealt with. There's no treatment of these questions. Ad kama sharisi, as far as I can tell. V'harei hi kemitzvah she'ein la doresh. It's as if it's a mitzvah that nobody has given much care to. V'kanal v'harbe yagati bo be'ezrat Hashem yisbarach. He says, and I worked so hard on this sefer that I am proud to present to you. And if you read the rest of the introduction, which is a couple of paragraphs, there's never a spin of like, oh, and I'm nothing and I'm worthless. The whole vibe, the whole notion of this sefer is, I see a place that I can contribute value. I see a place that I can contribute something to the Torah world. I am proud of what I did. I worked hard on this. I'm excited to show it to you. I hope that you enjoy and benefit from it. And so I guess my point is that we see that it's not so simple. We see that there's two legitimate ways to think. And to your point is that I think it's not about right or wrong. It's really about context. It's about what serves you best. What is the type of person you are? What is the type of situation you're in? What stage of life? The point, though, is not to take things for granted and assume that we have to default to this self-deprecation. Who am I? I'm so nothing. There is being an anav, being a humble person, is a very, very important midah, and there's many, 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 many sources that can emphasize that, probably beyond the scope of this conversation. But at the same time, I think the first important point is simply to emphasize that that's not the only way. Rav Chaim Kanievsky did not believe that, clearly. And he writes this, and there's other examples you can bring from other Sfarim. But I think that's the first important point, is to simply say there is another way to approach it and to reframe it for yourself.
And I think that, again, hopefully everyone who's listening to this will already have listened to our first conversation, and if not, you can go back and check it out, is that if you look at the entire Torah world as this big ladder, from the very big bottom to the very top, and everyone is on that ladder somewhere. So then obviously there are going to be so many people who are way above and ahead of me on that ladder. Great. But if we think about it differently, that there's this very, very broad canvas of different colors and different shades and different contributions that can be made to the Torah world. So then, as Rav Nachman says, I think he was attributed to have saying, Akash Baruch Hu, the day you were born was the day Akash Baruch Hu decided that the world cannot exist without you. So everyone's different. Everyone has their unique approach. Everyone has their unique take. So if you start thinking about it in those terms and you internalize that worldview, so what I'm doing is not what Rav Chaim Kanievsky did, and we're doing two totally different things. We're playing two totally different ball games, and so that really drives the self-confidence that you're saying that there are thousands of people alive and not long alive who knew more Shas than me. Okay, great, but that doesn't mean that they had the right experiences and the right setup in order to give their particular contribution to Klal Yisrael, to the Torah world, and in that way you have much more of a reason to believe that what you're doing is great and special and important, versus thinking about it more in terms of just like this very polar scale of how much Torah do you know or how smart you are, in which case there's a lot more room for you to think about how little you are and how nothing you know.
Yeah. And by the way, parenthetically, before I just respond to that point directly, for those of you out there who are like big sticklers for like prove it to me and show me a makor and a source and all these other things, I don't believe that Rav Chaim Kanievsky made up this approach. I think that if you look even in the Rishonim, and maybe we could link to it in the show notes, Rabbeinu Yonah writes in several places, one very clearly in his Sha'arei HaAvoda, and he's talking about just the foundational building blocks of how to become a productive Eved Hashem, and he speaks very clearly and dedicates many, paragraphs or even chapters to the point that a person needs to see himself as great. And he has to see himself as the son of great people and descended from great people, and not to look at them in a comparative kind of condescending light of who am I? And yes, there are Chazal that seem to allude to that. And yes, each one has to be treated differently. But the point is that Rabbeinu Yonah is saying that you have to look at yourself as capable. Hashem believes in me. Hashem give me kochos. I have to believe in those kochos. I have to leverage those kochos. I have to take inspiration from my parents, grandparents, mentors, teachers, friends, to be able to do more things, but the notion that we have to be completely self-deprecating is I think also just a shallow notion. I will suggest I do have a theory. This is crazy, and maybe some of the academics out there can help me with this. I have a theory as to why this became the pervasive kind of way of writing hakdamos to Sfarim, and why this is. I'm curious. Do you have like you talked about it maybe sociologically? If you look at the Rishonim, for example, at their introductions, you don't see a ton of this. You don't see like the Ramban like talking about how he's absolutely Ephes. A little bit poetic, I'll quote a pasuk here and there. But why do you think it is that like, you know, in the last couple hundred years, like things started to get very dark and negative in the introduction to the Svarim world, and only Rav Chaim Kanievsky is coming out of the woodwork and saying, no, you don't have to do this. Okay, so I have a theory, and my theory is, this is my unacademic, non-academic, unresearched theory. The Chassam Sofer, a couple hundred years ago, I don't know exactly when he lived, but whenever he lived, he was well known at his time. I think he lived in the time of the Maskilim, and there were all these like very hardcore movements within the Jewish world that the traditional conservative Jews, the conservative in the traditional sense, had to protect against. And one of the things that the Chassam Sofer was famous for doing was he wrote a few tshuvos, and he wrote very, very strongly against people who were publishing Svarim. He wrote that if a person publishes a sefer and he has any hidden agendas and he's just looking to get his name out there and to promote himself, and he doesn't have full, Yerushalayim, and his intentions are good, then all these terrible things will happen. He writes very, very strongly in intimidating terms. And you see in a lot of introductions to some of these, like, some of these more classics Svarim, that people will like actually tackle it head on. They'll apologize for it. Yeah, even though the Chassam Sofer says nobody should publish Svarim, I'm doing it for this reason, for this reason, for this reason. I wonder if you can correlate the negativity trend to those things, where a person is almost like using the negativity as an apologetic protection against the threats of the Chassam Sofer, and trying to avoid. But my take is that these days, where we're like one step beyond, and we're at the time where people are trying to find ways to do more and contribute more and build themselves up in today's society, maybe that's not as relevant.
That's interesting. There is a very particular example that my good friend Rav Moshe Gamliel pointed out to me, is that if you look in the Akdamah to Ktos HaChoshen, he really talks about how everyone has this ability to have a chelik in Torah, and he quotes the Joshua Saran, and he explained to me that this particular example of the Ktos was actually prefacing his sefer on Choshen Mishpat in light of the fact that Rav Yonasan Eibeshitz had just come out with the Tumim, and he really needed to be able to justify coming out with another sefer on Choshen Mishpat after the Gadol Hador had just put out the Urim Tumim. So that was just a very particular example, and it's interesting to think about.
It's very interesting, very interesting. But I want to just relate back, as we try to wrap this segment up, I want to relate back to what you were talking about a minute ago in terms of, this notion of like trying to respect and give value to your own contribution and your own progress, and not necessarily using other people as a yardstick. I think that really is one of the main drivers of this kind of like self-deprecation culture that we've gotten. Because again, just to like summarize where we're at in this conversation, there is a notion of humility, and there's the Stipler Goins kind of self-deprecation in his say, for whatever reason. And that's one part of it. But when it starts to translate to that second type of self-deprecation, where it's just me really not believing in myself, and me, not being able to progress in my learning because I'm not good enough, and I'm not, that really is largely a function of, I think, mistakenly just comparing yourself to others. Now, we live in a society where all we do is compare ourselves to others. Every single thing that we're doing, personally, professionally, social media, everything, our whole life is one big, scale that we have like some metric and some like seemingly, simple success metric, and we're trying to achieve it. And if we don't, or not to the extent of somebody else, then we're a failure. And I think that is, it's easy to say, very hard to do, but that is perhaps the most powerful reframing that all of us, I think, can benefit from, is to understand that it's not a zero-sum game, and my success is not measured or affected by your success, because your co-host and my co-host and your situation and my situation, it's just not the way the game works. And I remember seeing a powerful story, and quoted in the footnotes of the Chafetz Chaim al Torah. They told the story about a simple Jew who didn't have an opportunity to go to yeshiva. He didn't have a lot of knowledge, but he was very proud of himself and very proud of what he had learned. He had spoken, he had heard different drushos from other Gedolim of his time. He was an old Jew. And he would go around to the different yeshivas in that area of Europe, and he would simply give over some of the bits and pieces that he had heard from this Gadol, that Gadol. And they weren't highly sophisticated. They were just nice kind of nuggets or vartlach or ideas. And he would go to the yeshiva in Radin, and he would tell he would get the boys together and he would try to give over this little bit of Torah that he had collected. And as the story goes, the boys were very critical at first, and they some of them even mocked him and made him feel like, give me a break, like really you're wasting our time with this, like, you know, you really think that this is good Torah? And when the Chafetz Chaim heard this, you know, you would have expected, I guess, the Chafetz Chaim to come in and yell at them. That's fine, but you would have expected him to focus on midos and like, you know, this is not the proper way to treat people. That wasn't what he said. What he said was, in a nutshell, I'm paraphrasing, he says, you have no idea what Torah means. If Torah is like the basis of your life, you're going to cut somebody else's, lifeline off of them. You're going to say that his Torah is not good enough. Who are you to say that? Who gave you the measuring stick? That's that you have a completely warped sense of reality. That's his Torah. And just like the Vilna Gaon, I think he even related that the Vilna Gaon like almost wouldn't sleep or wouldn't eat, barely from Shabbos to Shabbos because he was so connected to his. He says, you think that the relative value is any less for this Rabbi Yaakov Darshan who's coming in to give his simple? That's his Torah. That's his Torah Misinai, and we can't make any less of that than the person who has more ability and more kochos and more opportunity. And I think that's just a reframing that would help everybody in every situation, is just stop looking at other people. Like it's really, really, and we can talk about that maybe in a coming up conversation, because that is a real thing, right? Comparing and kinnas sofrim and things like that. But at the end of the day, does it serve me? Is it going to help me learn better? And I think the important thing here to emphasize is that you can take the Reb Chaim Kanievsky approach and give yourself a pat on the back and understand that you are capable and you are able to do things perhaps beyond what you're giving yourself credit for.
Thank you so much for tuning in to Shtark Tank. Please make sure to leave a 5-star review and hit that subscribe button. It really helps us grow the show. Until next time, keep on steiging, Chevra.